But you talk about cost, and so I'm going to bring up the economic models.
Yeah.
To me, I think the huge thing about SDN is that it may lead to the birth of new economic models and an influx of much more network usage. How large a customer set is out there? How many people are out there today that say, well, I don't need to light up a 10 gig connection between these two cities for 3 months minimum, but I could sure use it this month for 2 weeks, or I could use it. I mean, how many people would then come and be able to pass that barrier, the economic barrier to entry to, yes, running a network between various sites? Do you see SDN like enabling new economic models? Because because that's what Amazon Compute did. Mm-hmm. People who can't afford to go buy their own supercomputer and lease it for a 3-year minimum lease say, but I can afford 2 hours of it because I just have one job to run. Couldn't and shouldn't a network work the same way, where I need to connect my various data centers, but it's only during my quarterly backup, or it's only during this end of year closing the books?
You can reach Amazon Compute from anywhere. Transport is a fixed location based.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of going to bring up, is that if you're connecting fixed data centers, then one, the access pipe already had to be in place so that you had connectivity to the network, and a lot of people don't overbuild that. I think a lot of times they should, because then that would open up that window. Right. But today that hasn't been the case. Now, granted, Ethernet transport, as opposed to TDM transport, is going to allow a lot of that, because maybe you can get a 10 gig pipe, but I'm only going to use 200 meg. Right. And then if I want to increment or decrement that, it's much easier to do. And that cost of that pipe wasn't substantial. Where we tried, there were some ways to do it in Sonnet, of course, but not ubiquitous across the entire industry. Ethernet transport would allow you to do that, so if I can open up that pipe coming in, then you might want to do that between your data centers. A lot of those folks, though, will buy a switch service from us to begin with, and they'll run it almost like you do over the Amazon, where you're doing it over public internet. You're just saying, well, I need a connectivity to the internet, and therefore I'm going to schedule that activity. I'm going to run it over that shared pipe, if you will, and it's not a dedicated pipe. That doesn't mean that infrastructure-wise. So I think if we wait for the customer to drive this, I'm not so sure it'll get there. You asked for the application driver. We've tried this with bandwidth on demand, and we just didn't get enough uptake to warrant building out a large infrastructure and putting all those resources in place and having them just sit there and burn power while people are waiting to use it, because we didn't have the users. But we said, well, let's take that same technology, which is just the control plane in the electrical switch, and then let's use it for our own use, for our own network management. How am I going to control my resources better? How am I going to go from 1+1 protection down to a mesh-based type protection system? And then it starts to make a lot of sense, because then we're saving money on what we have to do anyway. Right. And once you put it in place, then you can say, well, if I did have customer demand, I could open it up. I could open them a certain pool of that to them. But just to wait for the customer demand probably isn't going to be a big enough driver. At least we haven't seen it. Yeah. Again, we're not as big a wholesale carrier as some others. Maybe other folks have seen it. But we tried bandwidth trading, back in a decade ago, and it still didn't work out because there just wasn't that dynamic nature required. Although, like I say, if we did it as infrastructure, I do believe there's an opportunity to show the cost savings or the optimization, and then that would open it up for others.
Well, and does it matter at what percentage of our connectivity we're talking about? Bandwidth trading works great at 64 kilobits. Yeah. Voice is ubiquitous. You're trading off connectivity all the time for voice calls. But as it gets closer and closer to your line rate, the cost per connection goes up.
And the cost of the access piece goes up, right?
And the cost of the access piece goes up tremendously.
Now, all of a sudden, if somebody's going to drive 100 gig into the network, or especially multiples, because evidently they want to change it, they had to have that on both ends, and which didn't mean just two ends, because like we said earlier, turning it up, turning it down doesn't do us a whole lot of good. If you've got a half a dozen endpoints, that meant you bought a half a dozen 100 gig kind of connections into the network, and then you're going to want to provide connectivity between them. And so far, that type of customer generally goes and builds their own network, because maybe it's because we haven't made it cost effective enough. As a carrier, in order to attract that business, it's been lower cost of ownership for them to go build it. I would like to get to a point, and I assume that there is a point in there, a data rate. Perhaps it's not line rate. Today maybe that's 10 gig instead of 100 gig, where some folks are saying, I've got lots of those already connected in my network, and I'd like to move them around perhaps more dynamically than I do today.
And maybe once the 10 gig interfaces become low enough cost and you can actually afford access at 10 gig, even if you're not going to use it yet, then you might see it more. Like you're saying, Ethernet, we see it now. People put in much larger connections than they actually plan to use because the cost of the interface is pretty low. And if their access cost is also low, then you've got an opportunity there to go up and down on demand, as long as the network could also support it.
Yep, I agree that the difficult part of this cost or optimizing that portion of it, today has been that those connections are very static. So the big cities don't change. The amount of capacity between them is the same, relatively constant. Or at least we've got a peak hour, and those peak hours are the same all the time. It's been also discussed that maybe what you end up doing is defining defined networking for a small portion of the traffic. Right. In other words, it doesn't apply to everything. You only use it for what would be the dynamic, or where you could get some savings by using it in a dynamic fashion. No different than we did in the voice world. Like you said,
for different service types, for example. Is that what you're talking about?
Different service types and/or the amount that you're going to use for restoration, as opposed to what you're not going to, the fixed-up pipes that have protection or restoration done in a different layer.
So you mentioned peak times occurring at the same time. We do have, granted it's minimal, but we do have customer cases where customers who are in different businesses, where one's peak was in the middle of the day from orders, another peak was evening hours because it was consumers online after they get home, and then another one's peak was overnight backup, to where they shared a resource so that their peaks were at different times, and those are cases where they actually were switching colors around, sharing a dark fiber, then switching colors around, and so. That's a very simplistic case, and it's just, again, a very small customer set, but it shows the potential that as more and more people do this type of things, there's things maybe we're not seeing that could make use of these efficiencies.
And then as that area continues to grow, which I think it will, I mean, the whole idea of virtualizing your data center and/or outsourcing it to some degree, perhaps not all of it, but some of it, and then that'll, I assume, loosen up over time. Folks will say, why in the world did I ever own a data center when I could have had somebody else put up with this headache? Then I believe that'll drive that down there.